restricted plant food diets, they were missing certain nutritional elements, and when they did include animal foods in their diet, that made up for that difference.
Yeah.
But the problem wasn't with plant foods per se, it was with the restricted plant food diet based on human agricultural practices. Because clearly when human beings eat a plant-based diet that is based on a wide variety of plant foods, not only is it more than adequate, it is clearly much healthier for us. And so that was the mistake that they made, was thinking that these animal foods were necessary when the only reason they were important at that time was that because we were restricting ourselves to a limited number of plant foods, we were using the animals to do the sort of gathering of the wide variety of plant foods that we should have been doing.
Exactly.
And so that's kind of how that started. But then, of course, there's been a whole industry that has developed to support this idea. So, and again, in the late 1800s, people started with cattle ranching, and that's what the Westerns are all about, these giant cattle drives, where as the Western territories were opened, they would fence off these giant areas, raise the cattle, and then drive them, clear across the country to Chicago and places like that, where they had the slaughterhouses where the animals could be slaughtered and then transported to the eastern cities and markets where the foods were made available. The other thing that made large-scale animal farming practical, again, from the late 1800s on, was the Industrial Revolution and the development of refrigeration.
Yeah.
Because prior to the development of refrigeration, it simply wasn't practical to kill a 600, 700-pound animal because you couldn't eat enough of it to make it to make it practical before it rotted, unless you did it as most sort of less developed societies did, as a celebratory event where the entire village ate the animal, so that nothing went to waste at that one time.
And it's so funny, I love when I watch some of your YouTube material and you actually talk about that. It's people don't even think from the most logical standpoint. It's like, okay, if this was meant for my body, why can't I just eat raw meat?
Absolutely.
And why don't I have an issue with that? And why don't I have an issue with that? Because it's like, if it was, I tell people like this: if you take yourself off of meat for any long duration of time and then try to get back on it, what's going to happen? And they instantly know. They're like, well, I might get sick. Yeah. I was like, okay, so with the vegetables, if you took yourself off of vegetables and got back on vegetables, do you think you would get sick like you would eat the meat? And they automatically said, well, no. I was like, so doesn't that click for you? Doesn't that basic logic? Well, no, what about protein? The same comment.
We'll come back. Yeah, we'll come back to that. I have a very good friend, Dr. Tushar Mehta. He lives in Toronto, and he's come up with a term. He says, human beings are often described as omnivores, which we aren't. Mm-hmm. He says what we really are technovores, because we can't eat animal foods without technology.
Yeah.
We can't get the animal foods without technology. We can't process it without technology. We can't transform it into a form that we can ingest without killing ourselves without technology.
Yeah.
Which lets us know we should not be eating this stuff. Right. We're not meant to.
Yeah.
And the other thing that people don't think about, or they've come up with absurd theories to kind of get around this fact, is there is no species in nature, anywhere found in nature, where the female of the species is unable to procure the diet that she needs to both live, support a pregnancy, and raise her young. Mm-hmm. It is crystal clear that a pregnant human female cannot possibly go out and hunt because she would kill herself and her baby.
Yeah.
And so the way people have gotten around that is, she was dependent on the male to, the man to provide the food for her. Well, I think every woman that's listening to this right now is probably rolling her eyes. 'Cause
Right.
she knows how ridiculous that is.
how
It's just,
ridiculous
I
that
mean,
is,
Mother
yeah.
Nature knows what every human woman knows, that men are too damn undependable to stake your existence on them. And so it's just not, it's a ridiculous proposition that humans needed animal tissue, but the female of the species could not procure it on her own.
Exactly.
Especially when you factor in the fact that hunting is inherently dangerous, and animals that hunt are constantly being injured, if not killed, and as a result, it would be highly unlikely that women who were completely dependent on men to provide them, these animal foods would actually survive, or their children would survive, because the men would ultimately either, if not be killed, be injured to the point where they weren't able to hunt, and then all of a sudden, what's the woman going to do? I mean, studies have shown, again, that in Stone Age societies, 80% of the calories are always provided by the plant gathering efforts of the females.
Yeah.
And as a result, and you can, and just thinking about your diet, you can remove 20% of your diet and live. You cannot remove 80% of your diet and survive.
Exactly.
Right.
So clearly, it's always been the plant foods that have been most important. I say somewhat facetiously that I think hunting was a plot devised by women to keep men busy and out of trouble.
Get them out the way, probably.
I mean, because it's like men that are sent out to hunt, hang out with other guys, they chase stuff they never catch, they come home hungry, and they're appreciative of the food that the women have already prepared. Men just sitting around on their own with nothing to do end up chasing things other than food. And so if you give them something to do, you keep them busy, you keep them out of trouble. That's my theory.
That's how it went down. That's how you're sticking it to.
That's exactly how it went down.
So we have been brought up on this terrible food pyramid.
Oh my gosh.
And obviously that is an incorrect standard for how one should eat. So what does a healthy diet truly consist of?
Well, let me just take a minute to talk about why we ended up with the ridiculous food pyramid.
Money. We were getting paid.
I have participated in several revisions of the U.S. Dietary Guidelines. When I moved to Washington, D.C. to complete my residency at Georgetown, I started working with PCRM, which is the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. And one of the first big projects I did with them was we participated in the, I don't remember exactly which one it was. It was somewhere around 94, 95 revision of the U.S. Dietary Guidelines. Well, going into that process, I had assumed that the U.S. Dietary Guidelines were put out by the Department of Health and Human Services, because that would make sense, right? It's the department that is concerned with our health that should be telling us what to eat.
Exactly.
That's not who puts it
Yeah.
on. U.S. Dietary Guidelines are put out by the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture.
They don't know
And
it.
from their inception, the dietary guidelines were not designed to promote health. They were designed to encourage Americans to eat more of what was being produced by American farmers.
Exactly.
Now,
Right.
of course, when they formed that initial committee to formulate these guidelines, they couldn't say, we're just trying to create a bigger market for our products. So they did put together this committee that was made up of, some health experts, but there were, half to, say 60% of the committee members were from industry. And you immediately had this conflict and tension between the health panel members and those from industry, because the people on the health side wanted to recommend eating less meat, less fat, less sugar, more fiber, more whole plant foods, more fresh vegetables and fruits. Whereas the industry operatives were like, oh, if people start doing that, they're not going to be buying our product.
Yeah.
They're not going to be buying the meat. They're not going to be buying the dairy, eggs, and cheese. And so you had this internal struggle. And so they came up with this compromise position where initially it was the so-called four food groups, one of which was dairy foods. It is absurd to call dairy foods a food group.
Exactly.
Dairy foods are built around the mammary secretions of another species. No human being should be sucking on the tip of a cow.
And that's so
or
funny.
any other animal.
That's so funny that people don't understand that basic
Right.
concept.
Put it
It's
that
like,
way.
It's like we don't even drink our own mother's
Right,
milk past
exactly.
the age of 9 months, or
And you shouldn't.
Yeah.
And so it is ludicrous to call these invented, artificial foods a food group. They're not. They're just something we made up. I mean, they're no more a food group than meth is a medicine. I mean,
That's real.
Right.
And so that that was a problem right there. But then again, you had the meat producers and the egg board, and they really exerted their influence, and so just every time the revision was done, there was this conflict and this push to base the guidelines more on science rather than what people
Actually needed.
or what industry wanted them to actually purchase. And so that's how you got the evolution from the 4 food groups to the food pyramid. And the idea of the pyramid was at its base you have whole grains, and then fruits and vegetables, and then you have the so-called meat group and dairy group, and then at the top you have oils and so forth. And the problem with that visually has always been that in the human mind, we always assume that which is at the top is best. And I think that was a deliberate sort of visual misnomer, if you will, or that they wanted people to have that mistaken idea that as you go up,
You're
the
getting better
food
for your
pyramid,
body.
you're getting higher quality foods. I had one friend that I worked with. He said, it should have been a food funnel, whereas the stuff at the bottom, was the stuff you should eat the least of, whereas the stuff at the top was the best. And then, again, because that was just visually misleading and unclear, it ultimately involved into the food plate now. Right. I mean, those dietary guidelines are heavily influenced by industry operatives, and I would encourage anyone who has the opportunity to either observe or participate in the dietary guidelines revisions to do so, because it is a eye-opening and mind-blowing experience to sit there and watch people from the Mars Candy Company talk about the health benefits of eating candy bars.